Today is week 7, and we're going to talk about Britain and the abolition of the slave trade. We've examined a number of individuals who were caught up in the slave trade. We're going to talk about another one this week. His name is Muhammad Gardo Bakwakwa, and the readings are his autobiography, and particularly focusing on the time that he spent in Africa before he was taken to Brazil in 1845. We're going to use the biography as a way of looking at the interior of West Africa in this period, which will help us to understand what the context was for the British campaign to abolish the slave trade. In the lecture itself, I'll be talking about that abolition campaign, and particularly examining what it helps us to know about African history during this period. Because the British abolished the slave trade in 1807 at a time when Britain itself was the largest slave trading country in the world. And in doing so, it therefore really transformed and changed the slave trade, the nature of the slave trade. Thereafter, the most important countries involved in the slave trade itself were Brazil and Cuba. Brazil, technically a colony of Portugal, and then when the Portuguese government moved to Brazil after the Napoleonic Wars, actually the seat of the Portuguese government. But when we talk about Portugal and the slave trade in the 19th century, we're really talking about Brazil and the slave trade. Cuba was one of the last remaining colonies of the Spanish Empire, and the most important one in the 19th century. And most of the merchants that we're dealing with that are referred to as Spanish are in fact were from Cuba, and hence were really Cuban merchants. So that the trade after 1807 was a trade that came to be dominated by Brazil and Cuba, which again completely transformed the nature of the transatlantic slave trade. Because before that time it was European countries and European ports that were the most important in terms of where ships came from that were involved in the trade. In the 19th century, the ports where the ships came from were in the Americas itself, Havana and Rio de Janeiro becoming the two largest of the slave trading ports. So the British campaign was intended to gradually get every country in Europe to agree to abolition, and then was aimed specifically at ending the trade to Brazil and ending the trade to Cuba, although the campaigns in both of these cases were much more difficult and took much longer to achieve. And what another detail that is very important in looking at the abolition movement is the fact that the British Navy became very heavily involved in an attempt to suppress the trade, and the way they did that was to intercept slave ships on the open seas, and if there was evidence on board that the ship was involved in slaving, then it was taken to a port where there was a court and where the ship captain was tried before that court for illegal slave trading. Now that could only happen when Britain had treaties with different countries that allowed them to board ships and in effect intercept the ships in a legal way. And of course, the clearest evidence that a ship was involved in slave trade was if slaves were on board, although in fact the British Navy would even intercept ships that had all of the paraphernalia related to slavery: chains, whips, mechanisms to restrain slaves on board and underneath the ship, the way they were outfitted. Any evidence like that was also evidence that the ship was involved in the slave trade and could be used to condemn the ship and either destroy the ship or to sell it on the open market to get some money that would help to pay for the costs of the British Navy. But the British were really, it was more of a symbolic gesture, the effort to crush the slave trade through suppression. In the end, only maybe 5% of the whole number of people that were enslaved in the 19th century were intercepted by the British. And that means that 95% of the people that were enslaved in Africa and were still taken to the Americas. And in the 19th century, that meant almost exclusively being taken to Brazil and to Cuba. So on the one hand, it's only a very small percentage. On the other hand, because of the random nature of the capture of ships, it's the sample of ships that were intercepted and the details about people that were on board those ships actually is a pretty representative sample of what the trade itself was like, and also the impact on those parts of Africa that were most directly affected by the slave trade. And it's really this dimension of the abolition movement that we're going to be looking at through the readings and also through a website that I will walk you through also that relates to the people that were taken off the slave ships. Because as part of the evidence before these various courts around the Atlantic world, the evidence was the slaves themselves that were on board. And what the British Navy did very meticulously was it recorded the names and details of every individual on board the ships that were captured. It did that because those people and the details about them and their enslavement was part of the evidence that was used to condemn the ships. For historians, this happens to be extremely fortunate because the amount of detail that we have on the people that were taken off the ships is enormous, and that has enabled certain kinds of analysis that we'll begin to look at a little bit today. The people that were taken off the ships, the slaves, were called at the time liberated Africans. It sounds as if they were Africans who were taken off the ships and that were liberated, but in reality they were not liberated. They were taken off the ships and then they had to serve a period of apprenticeship from 7 to 14 years, which meant that in many ways they were very much like slaves. So the liberated Africans were in fact not liberated. They were, but nonetheless, their lives were completely changed when they became indentured workers. So one of the ways that we're going to look at the abolition movement, the readings for this week focus on the individual Muhammad Gardo Bakwakwa. Muhammad Gardo Bakwakwa was taken to Brazil from West Africa in 1845. His ship was not intercepted by the British. The ship landed its human cargo to the north of Recife, away from the major ports, and that was one of the techniques that were used to avoid seizure by the British Navy. And Bakwakwa's account is particularly unusual and therefore very interesting because he wrote his autobiography in 1854, and he actually wrote that biography here in Canada, in Chatham, in now what's Ontario. At the time Ontario was known as Canada West. and the town of Chatham was a major stopping point on the Underground Railroad from the United States. And Becquaqua was there in his bid to continue to receive support so that he could return to Africa. But Becquaqua's story is unusual because he was taken as a slave to Brazil, but was freed in New York City almost by accident, because his master took him to New York at a time when slavery had been abolished in New York State, and therefore he was able to acquire his freedom when he reached New York City. And so we'll look at his story. He came from the interior of West Africa. He was a Muslim, and we'll talk about him in more detail.